Briefly talk a little bit about where we've been. As I mentioned, we started this program back around 1990, but prior to that, all we had was the low bid. And like most state DOTs, we had a statute that required the award of construction contracts to the lowest responsive bidder, meeting the state's requirements for responsibility. Then around the late 1980s, things began to change, and there was a group that went over to Europe, and they looked at some European countries' methods for delivering projects, which included concessions, design-build projects, warranties. And they came back to the United States, and they said to Federal Highway and the Transportation Research Board, why can't we do that? Why are we tied to the low bid? Can we do something different other than the low bid? So that's when FHWA was receptive to that, and we rolled out a program called Special Experimental Project Number 14, and that allowed the states to evaluate and experiment with contracting methods that weren't consistent with the low bid concept, whether it was warranties, design build, lane rental, you name it. We tried a bunch of things starting in the early 90s. So all that happened 27 years ago. Almost 28 years now. It seems like ancient history for some of us, but time has marched on. The first project that we had under SEP-14 was a design-build project. It was a toll agency project in Southern California, Transportation Corridors Agency, and they had about a $300 or $400 million toll road, which was delivered through design-build, and it was a federal aid project. So that was Federal Highway's first experiment with design-build way back in 1990. And then time marched on. We allowed the states to use a lot of these things. We evaluated under SEP 14, design-build. We probably had 200 or 300 projects before we operationalized it. Congress passed a law saying that Federal Highways must implement a regulation to implement design-build. And we did that in the late 2010 through 2012 era. Similarly, with CMGC, Congress passed a law saying you need a regulation to implement that. So over the years, over the past 27 years, Federal Highways has allowed the states to evaluate. We've posted their work plans and then their evaluations on our website. Hopefully people are learning from that as time goes along. And eventually we've operationalized a lot of these techniques. The experiment is still ongoing. You would think after 28 years, people would run out of ideas. But not so true. Wherever there's an opportunity for innovation, saving money, being efficient, being cost effective, people are going to come up with new ideas that we haven't tried before. A lot of states have been using IDIQ or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts for many years. Some use it in the consultant area, some use it in the preventive maintenance area, but the concept is you're asking contractors to bid on unit prices for preventive maintenance work. They're assigned a geographical area for a contract term, could be 2 or 3 years, and then you issue task orders as the state needs to do this preventive maintenance. So I think that's going to be the next frontier that we're probably going to look at operationalize is IDIQ, sometimes called job order contracts. How many have heard those terms before, IDIQ or job order? And does TDOT use those in some fashion or not? No? Okay. Anyway, they're very flexible, good for preventive maintenance, and I think that'll be the next low-hanging fruit that we're going to try to emphasize and at least operationalize and move it forward. Best value is going to take some time, but a number of states have state laws that allow them to award construction contracts on a basis other than low bid. They can look at a contractor's experience, a contractor's staff, their quality track record with the state DOT, and they can award construction contracts on a best value basis. So we have a number of states that are evaluating that. We have one state that is, I would call it, out on the bleeding edge of innovation. It's very controversial, but New Mexico has implemented a system called performance-based contractor pre-qualification and procurement. I told the industry yesterday it would take me about 10 to 15 minutes to explain it, and I'm not going to attempt to do so this morning, but essentially they're rating contractors on what they do, on how they perform. Material tests, construction workmanship, claims, change orders, and you say, how can that be fair if you're rating a contractor on their claims experience? But they've defined it in a way that the claim has to be appealed to the highest level before it marks or is considered against the contractor. So they have all these criteria, they develop annual scores, and then this score feeds back into their procurement process, such that if a contractor has a score less than 1, his bid price is reduced for consideration. So they're taking this global concept of contractor performance and then taking those results and feeding it into their procurement process and rewarding contractors that have a good track record. It also encourages those contractors with substandard performance to improve. So I think you could understand why industry would be very concerned if how they're rolling that out, and they were. But as of today, New Mexico has about 20 contractors now with these annual ratings. And it's a really unique and innovative system that seems to be working for them. There were issues with it. Won't get into that. As I said, that's a longer presentation. Very briefly, we're looking at some other methods under Set 14, ATCs in bid build. Your neighbors up there in Missouri seem to have gone wild with this. They like getting ATCs even on bid build projects. They're awarding these contracts to the lowest responsive bidder. But contractors are coming in with different ideas on how to improve the design. And if the state accepts that ATC, then that becomes the job or the project, the scope that they're bidding on. So are we comparing apples and oranges? Well, they're not really apples and oranges, but they may be Fuji apples and Granny Smith apples in some cases, because the substructure that contractor A is bidding on may be different than the substructure that contractor B is bidding on. But the Missouri is awarding it to the lowest responsive bidder. So that's an interesting area that we'll be tracking. I still have some questions how it's going to play out with changes and what happens when the contractor needs to change the nuances of its ATC after it's been awarded. Who's responsible for those changes? So things like that are going to take some time to shake out and define. And who is the engineer of record? It's still the state. It's still the state's plans, but then there are fairness issues that have yet to be fully flushed out. Alliance contracting, I'll just briefly mention. It could be the future years from now, but the concept is that you'll be getting a team together, planners, designers, people that specialize in the environment, construction contractors, material suppliers, people that maintain a project, having this broad, giant team of individuals that will form the design, construct, operate, maintain team, and then the state will developing a project with the alliance from day one. And they'll have a series of target prices that they have to meet. It's very complex and convoluted, but it's working now in New Zealand, Australia, and some of the gas industry companies are using this alliance contracting method. So it's got possibilities. I think it's got a ways to come before we can look at it in the Federal Highway Administration, especially with our conflict of interest provisions in the NEPA process. But it's an idea that somebody's come up with. We'll be looking at it. Washington State DOT started to do this, but they were not able to pull things together to go to a contract award. So a number of issues are still floating out there. Some of these are pretty wild. How many of you know Steve DeWitt, formerly with North Carolina DOT? He used to call this wacky contracting, and that's, I still use that term when I'm talking with Steve, that some of these ideas are pretty wacky in nature, but they're working for some states.